Good morning. I'm Jeff Coleman.
And I'm Deborah Pinkerton. Welcome to Morning Light. We want to share some exciting news from the Lighthouse family.
Big news.
That's right. Our director, Josh, and his fiancée, Ella, got married over the weekend. Beautiful.
Perfect.
Yes.
Just about the perfect wedding and for the perfect couple. Look at us there, all dressed up, happy.
Such a nice time.
That's before we went dancing, wasn't it? Yeah.
We'll talk about that later.
Well, switching gears, some recognize June as Pride Month. Should corporate values be driven by profit alone or something deeper, like a worldview? Our Morning Light panel will tackle this difficult topic, but a very relevant one.
But first, here is a preview of what's coming up later in the show. This week marks the 53rd anniversary of Hurricane Agnes. Pennsylvanians remember the raging waters flooding their homes, businesses, and churches. We will hear how one church in central Pennsylvania witnessed what some may consider a miracle, and how other churches came together and started a nonprofit to help the victims.
The beauty for ashes really coming out amazing. Well, every June for the past 2 decades, small businesses and corporations face a choice to fly or not fly the rainbow flag. That's the political symbol, of course, of the LGBTQ movement. And unlike the MAGA flag and the Confederate stars and bars and the yellow "Don't Tread on Me" flag, the rainbow is an immediate flashpoint in the culture. Few are undecided or indifferent. Even some churches have embraced the latest variation of the LGBTQ movement flag in solidarity.
But with some political change in Washington and a shift on cultural issues, some of the biggest corporations are sidestepping bold statements of inclusion and diversity. Target is swapping out pride displays for patriotic Made in America merchandise. In past years, Target has been boycotted by conservative Christians. This year, now a progressive Atlanta pastor is calling for boycotts of Target and other retailers for what he considers DEI rollbacks.
I think people are getting a little bit of whiplash, wondering when does a corporation at some point actually believe something, you know? So what happens when the corporate conscience shifts between issues like gun rights versus gun control, or environmental conservation and stewardship versus, say, the green agenda, or support for adoption or abortion providers like Planned Parenthood? What happens when marketing and public relations is only focused on the bottom line? Is there room for companies who actually believe their stated values? And where do we find our values when our own religious values seem to be changing too? We'll take these hard questions to the Morning Light panel this morning. But for a Monday morning, a panel that is ably equipped to do this. Josh Robertson, good to have you back.
Glad to be here.
Cynthia Lyons, good to have you.
Thank you.
Scott Barger, fresh from the Capitol. Are you in session this week?
We are.
Okay.
We're in every hour of every day, it seems, this month.
So if anybody wants to watch you in action, go to the Peanut Gallery. You can't throw things over because there's glass there.
You could. You might. It's discouraged. But.
Let me begin with you, Scott. This idea of corporations almost every few years undergoing a major metamorphosis where they almost discard all of the values of the past, change them, and it's reflected in storefronts, store displays, what the buttons people wear at the checkout line. What do you make of corporations who find values so flexible, I guess is the word?
You know, I'm of two opinions here.
Yeah.
One, do I blame them for wanting to sell their products, goods, or services to people? And if they are trying to adapt to the shifting kind of values of culture, that can be difficult, especially, right, like you said, when culture seems to be shifting every couple of years. So I don't fault them for trying, but I do believe it gets to be a little bit disingenuous when the issues that you believe in are a step or two beyond what is my favorite football team. And it goes into very important core philosophical worldview kinds of issues. And when you see an organization, whether it's a church or a corporation, a company, switch on core values like this, I think, for me at least, it's just disingenuous. So I understand why they're trying,
right,
but at some point we have to admit there are some things that are true that we hold on to,
sure,
regardless of whether it's going to help us sell more of our products, goods, or services.
So how do you, Cynthia, how do you make the changes then? So when you're going from one change to the next, you know, you've worked in education for a very long time. That's another area where values seem to shift very, very quickly. But it doesn't seem to me, maybe I'm wrong, but that there are ethicists or religious leaders or even parents brought to the conversation about when the values should change. It just happens, and there's a memo, and there's a directive. You shall not wear, you shall display, you shall not display. How does this happen? Take us into the inside of how that might happen in your world, for example.
Sure. I mean, and this is all about sort of marketing that piece. Whether we're marketing for Hobby Lobby and Chick-fil-A, I mean, there's a reason they're not open on Sundays and haven't been. But then there's also that marketing piece for our high schools, our school systems, and really in our school system, they don't make too many changes without getting a sense of how everybody feels about it. Like our principal talks to the kids in the school before he says, you can't wear a hat. You know, you can't do this or you can't do that. Now, sometimes there has to be some quick decisions made just by way of how it may affect, you know, the grand population of things. But in general, this is why we talk about in our small communities, really like our school boards, our borough councils, things like that are making decisions for our small communities, you know, that really do affect everybody and make those changes quickly.
So where do you anchor change then if you are only anchoring it to, on one hand, opinion, which is important, but opinion is subject to what people have watched on TikTok often, right? Or when it comes to the structure of corporate ethics, if they're not anchored in a worldview, where do you get them?
I mean, I think what we're seeing in real time is what the scripture says, that the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. Because now you have corporations and organizations and sometimes even churches pandering or catering to wherever the shareholder or whoever is bankrolling. Right. Instead of, you know, the love of people should be the root of all good. And so I think we've shifted as a society and we've made money our God. And I think we're living in a world where whatever it takes to make the dollar, whatever it takes to do that is what people are doing.
Do you feel pressure? Do you feel pressure when all the churches in the neighborhood say, okay, this month we're going to fly this flag, or this month we're going to adopt this program? I know some of our panelists feel this pressure constantly, and not just on the issue of the month, LGBTQ rights and Pride Month, but on a whole host of issues. Pastors feel this pressure to take the political statement of the day and fuse it into a sermon or hang it outside the door. Do you feel that pressure?
No, I mean, I feel like this. I feel like that a pastor has to respond to who called the pastor to be the pastor. I believe I was called by God to preach the scripture. And so that means sometimes, you know, ruffling the feathers of my members. You know, I've had members, you know, not appreciate what I've said from the pulpit, but my job is to make you holy, not happy. And so the way I believe that translates to the world is that if I preach the gospel right, you'll love people and you'll consider others as you consider yourself. So when you vote, you'll do that. When you shop, you'll do that. When you're on a board, whatever you're doing, you'll look at the world through the lens of Christ if I'm doing my job right.
You brought the L word up, love. How do you do it? Because people, I think, sometimes get ahead of steam and the conviction comes, this ain't right, you know, and then you go straight into the culture and says, thus says the Lord, change. But the love is what often the culture pushes back and says, but I don't feel what you say you preach.
Yeah, you can't, this guy, right, is right on the money. And as a former pastor and wanting to preach, sometimes you feel like the prophetic call to challenge, to decry the common consciousness. What is wrong with this world? But I've never successfully changed someone's mind without first demonstrating that I care about them and care about what they think. Like, take the time to understand why they believe that it's important to have this flag outside their door this month versus something else. I will not ever bully someone into changing their mind, even about what product to buy, let alone to augment or change or transform their worldview because I attack them. I must first demonstrate that I care about them and understand what they believe.
Okay, so I know there's some people watching who say, oh, come on, Representative. You're on the floor of the House. You've got to call it out. You've got to tell them where they're wrong, and you've got to be that prophetic voice, but you've got to add fire to it. How do you maintain the conviction but have that soft exterior which engages people in love?
I think that you are bolstering your ability to do that every day by the way you treat people. You treat people with love every day, with respect every day, as much as you can. And then when you say, listen, you know that I'm not here to attack you. I've demonstrated this in my life, but this thing that you're saying, this thing that you believe, or this bill that you're trying to pass is wrong.
So do you have that conversation offline before you go to the floor?
You're doing it all the time. I think it's a lifestyle. You have to have the reputation of, I'm not a bully. I'm not someone who's trying to force my agenda on other people, but I will speak the truth as I see it, respectfully towards other people.
Cynthia, I know that people like you and respect you often because they find you to be a straight talker. So likely, if you saw someone with pants that are too short or a shirt that is too short or too long, or you would probably say it. How do you make those confrontations but do it in a way that doesn't break the relationship? So how do you, in a month like this where you may have different convictions, how do you express love and openness and acceptance and not judgment, while at the same time not embracing something you don't believe?
Yeah, and I think you have to bring everything in. I think you have to bring love. I think you have to bring truth. And I think you have to bring discussion. And, you know, what Scott said about, I don't hate people. I disagree with some of them sometimes. But you have to do it. You have to walk in the path with love so that people see that you're coming in, what you're bringing to the discussion comes from the heart. And it is really for the goodness of others. People don't always disagree. When I'm talking to teenagers and saying, pull your shirt down or wear something that looks a little different, it's called decorum. But they may not necessarily always agree, but I want to make sure that they know I'm coming in love. I
see that, yeah. Last 30 seconds, how do we then land this conversation in a place where you can speak truth, but people don't immediately assume that truth equals hate because you don't agree?
Sure, absolutely. I think we have to value that disagreement is fundamentally pointing us to integrity. It doesn't take any integrity at all to agree with you. It takes integrity to communicate that I disagree. So how can we be a true community? How can we really be the beloved community if we can't be honest with one another? So you may not like what I have to say, but you should be happy that I shared it with you, even if we disagree. I think that's what makes for true community.
And thank you all for speaking truth in a lot of love today, because I heard it. Well, do you remember where you were when Hurricane Agnes struck Pennsylvania? The historic storm flooded homes and businesses and churches, but in the midst of all the destruction, God performed what some call a miracle. We'll tell you about it up next. You're watching Morning Light right here on Lighthouse TV.
This week marks the 53rd anniversary of Hurricane Agnes. The massive storm swept through the state, causing more than $2 billion in damage and claiming dozens of people's lives. Despite all of the destruction, a Harrisburg church witnessed something some may call a miracle. Take a look.
The Green Street Church was an older church. They had had several minor floods even before that, because it does sit on Green Street, which is close to the river. But the flood in 1972 was the biggest that we had ever had.
Water right into the sanctuary. Of course, the basement was filled. All the pews were destroyed because of the flood waters.
The pews were thrown around like they were toothpicks.
Virtually nothing was salvaged except one thing, and that was the Bible.
I used to pray at the communion table that held the Bible right in front of the pulpit. And if I touched that with my finger, it would tip over.
Anytime you would bump that communion table, that family Bible would fall over because the stand just wasn't working right.
But that Bible never tipped over, floating around the church during the flood and landing between those two railings, and the Bible was standing on its stand, not touched. That was God. God was with us.
And joining us now to talk more about that is Jim Schambach. You were a member of the church. Let's go back to 1972.
Yeah, in 1972, I was a junior, finished my junior year at Penn State Capitol campus, and working at the Arthritis Foundation as what they called a traffic coordinator. I helped pick up packets of money and distributed literature to people at that time.
And so talk to us about the flood.
So it was pretty devastating. I remember trying to get into town to go to work, and of course the bridges were closed. Water had risen to heights that I'd never seen before. I remember I went with my father to look at the city. We went on the Pennsylvania Railroad Bridge, the Reading to Harrisburg Bridge, and I realized we couldn't get across. The water was everywhere. And when finally the waters receded, we were able to get into town, and we saw tremendous devastation at the church and in the community itself. It was amazing.
So talk to us about when you walked in the church.
So when we walked into the church, in the sanctuary, the pews were on top of each other. The organ was turned over. The piano was moved quite a distance. But the altar was in the right place. It stayed in the same place, and stayed to the same place in the book of Nehemiah, where it says that God instructed Nehemiah to rebuild the walls of the city. And so we were amazed at that. But cleaning out the church, putting out the furniture that we had, carrying out the pews, me and my buddies, we were able to help the deacons and other members of the church do that. And it was a very important time in my life.
I was going to say, and just your reaction, though, as far as the Bible being there, especially to that passage.
It was amazing. And it was kind of a direction. The pastor himself was convinced that God was speaking to us as a congregation. And he felt that there would be a better chance if we would rebuild in a different location. And so the church eventually moved to Progress Avenue. It was a church of maybe 250 to 300 at the time, but it grew exponentially when it went to Progress Avenue. I think at that time it was over 1,000 people when the church opened its doors in 1976.
Oh my goodness. Looking back, how do you see that God really led you through this time, family, community?
So in my junior year, I felt God calling me into ministry. I didn't really fully understand the significance of that call until much later, but I got my feet wet serving the congregation and helping remove all the debris that was in there, helping reset chairs so that we could have a service 2 weeks later in the sanctuary, and then walking with the pastor and the leaders of the church to try and rebuild and to create an atmosphere where people, not only in our church congregation, would feel welcome, but people in our community would feel as welcome as well. So for me, it was like giving me an idea of what life would be like as a pastor. And it took me after I finished my degree at Penn State, I went on to Bible college and then seminary, and ended up getting a doctoral degree and being an executive pastor in a mega church and having a ministry, 2 different ministries of my own. But it was formative. It gave me a taste of what it meant to be a servant and to serve people in our congregation and in our community.
So this event changed the direction of your life.
It clearly did. And I ended up better understanding what ministry was all about because of that experience, and how other people united around this one traumatic event, and how we came together as a congregation, and how crises could be a way to bring about a greater good for a community and a congregation.
And when we have events like that, we have to rely on God and realize that He will be with us every step of the way.
Yeah, I think that's one of the takeaways. We are sometimes delivered from things that are difficult. We go through difficult times to get to a better place. And our congregation, that's what happened. They ended up not only surviving, but thriving in the days ahead with God's help and the support of good leadership in our church.
Jim, thank you so much for being with us and sharing your journey.
Thank you for having me.
And coming up next on Morning Light, while Pennsylvanians were at a great loss, local churches and ministries rallied to provide the support so many people needed. We will share how Hurricane Agnes launched the start of a nonprofit. We are back in 1 minute. Welcome back. People from all faith backgrounds joined together to meet the needs of those who lost everything in the aftermath of Hurricane Agnes. Messiah Lutheran Church was one church that played a pivotal role in the cleanup efforts. Joining us is Kevin Pry. Thank you for being with us this morning. So there were so many people who lost so many different things. They were homeless, they didn't have food, and your mother, among other churches, played a significant role. Tell us about that.
Well, my mother had been raised Lutheran, and but had, in the course of her marriage to my father, had gone back and forth between different Protestant sects without any sort of seamlessly doing that. And she had always been involved in church work from the time my earliest memories are her going off to a thrift shop to run a thrift shop for a local hospital, that kind of stuff. And we lived in Columbus, Ohio, and in St. Louis, and then finally came here when I was in my teens. And Messiah Lutheran Church happened to be the place we ended up because we had a cousin there who was the assistant minister, Duke Fries, who's now living in Baltimore. But we were welcome there, and we were not welcome as people from out of town. We were not welcome at many churches of the different denominations we had belonged to because they were just not interested in new people. So it was very refreshing to have a sort of faith home there where that would be taken care of. And the church the Messiah had a long history of, what some people would now call social justice work. In other words, making sure that the least of us were taken care of. And then this horrible event happened, and it wasn't unfortunately for me, it was not it was not my first rodeo when it came to natural disasters, because we had lived in Columbus, and I remember at 4 being flooded in our local neighborhood in Columbus. Lived in the Mississippi Valley. You couldn't get away from the idea of flooding. Lived in Tornado Alley for years.
So they were very familiar with it, so they started a food bank.
Yes. So what happened was that my mother had been through all this stuff in her life, and she was a Depression-era child. My father was a greatest generation soldier. So, they thought about, you had to put your axe where your mouth was. And so there's this crying need, and it was obvious because we were all cleaning up people's houses also, just dumping stuff out, and the mounds of stuff were horrible. And one of the things I remember most distinctly was the amount of spoiled food stuff that was just everywhere. So the food pantry was founded by my mother and a whole bunch of church ladies and gentlemen from all over, not just Christian congregations, but from all over. That's why it's always been called the Ecumenical Food Pantry. And it was originally called the Food Bank, but that name, we allowed the Central Pennsylvania Food Bank to take that over, because they were the people who were funneling stuff, and they were much later than we were. We were just collecting the stuff and looking for people to donate. And Messiah was on high ground, and that was the basic reason it became the headquarters. So they did all of this from scratch, often improvising what will work, what won't work. And it came ultimately an incredibly sophisticated institution, which, would get people would be referred from agencies and other faith organizations, and we were trying to make sure that the food, my mother and everybody who worked with her was always trying to make sure that the food got to people who needed it with a minimum of waste and a maximum of efficiency, and that meant a lot of hands.
A lot of hands, and certainly being the hands and feet of Jesus Christ, so much needed during this time. Thank you so much for being with us, Kevin. We really appreciate you sharing this with us.
Okay, thank you.
And stay with us. We are back right after the break.
Welcome back. Well, that wedding we told you about at the beginning of the show for Josh and Ella was really one for the books. It was really special.
It really was. It was elegant. The dress, the flowers, the bridal party, the playlist.
And Deborah, even my filet was just about as perfect as you'd wanted for the first day of this very special couple's life. But it was the theme of the wedding, one woven into every piece of the ceremony, from the hymns to the vows to the best man's toast. The message that without Christ at the center, without each of them dying to their own ambitions and yielding to God's mission for their life together, this new marriage, any marriage, won't last.
And it was a reminder for all of us who've been married for a while or thinking about it. The strongest marriages aren't negotiated business deals or the ultimate legal contract, but a covenant. The man, the woman yielding to God, putting Him first and last in everything, letting Him set the terms.
So Josh and Ella are a shining witness to a world who doesn't always remember or honor the real meaning of marriage. So when you see them out there in the world, we think you'll agree.
We want to thank you for watching.
And go ahead and check on your neighbors, and we'll see you again soon.